Okay, I think we're all live. So welcome everybody to this Scrutiny Management Committee public hearing session with the Committee for Employment and Social Security. So that's to those present and those watching on the live stream. And today we'll be focusing principally on the areas of the committee's mandate that are contained in the government work plan. So I'm Deputy Yvonne Burford, and with me on the panel today are Mr. Andrew Lalever, Deputy Simon Fairclough, Mr. Mark Huntington, who is the Principal Officer, Deputy John Dyke, and Deputy Bob Murray. So it's not going to be possible to cover anywhere near everything in the short time we have available, but in preparing the questions, we have sought to be as wide-ranging as possible, but while concentrating on those areas that are of significant public interest or where there are significant sums of public money involved. So following this session, there will be a Hansard transcript put onto the Scrutiny website, and we will also consider whether we want to follow up any items any further. So if everyone can ensure their phones are switched off, please. We'll be having a break at around about 11 o'clock, and I'd now turn to our witnesses today, so if you could please introduce yourself, starting with Mr. Ashton. Thank you.
Deputy Lindsay de Summers, Vice President of the committee.
Deputy Peter Roffey, President.
Ellen Pragnell, Committee Secretary.
In the first set of questions, which are largely to do with housing, but including the Housing Action Group and key worker accommodation. So, Deputy Roffey, you have said that in your opinion at least 1,000 new social housing and key worker homes are required, and that you are nearly halfway there in acquiring or identifying them. Have any further sites been identified since you made these comments last year?
Yes, I know that it's difficult because obviously the main arm for procuring sites is through the Guernsey Housing Association, and I know that they are in final stage negotiations in some case with the owners of potential sites. I do know, though, that the GHA will tell you that they have been blighted in their attempts by the rumours or backwash of conversation about the possibility of the removal of GP11. They're saying people are just not willing to consider bids at the moment because they say, well, why do it now? Let's wait a year or so. Let's see if our sites become more valuable. So that is forming a real break and a frustration in trying to actually drive the social housing agenda forward. We do own, obviously, quite a lot of sites, and we will be looking at some infill sites around the existing social housing estates, and we will also be handing over to the GHA the Janard estate, which will be redeveloped, and as a result of its phased redevelopment, we'll create a lot more housing units than there is there now, and hopefully a far better designed estate. We've got Kenilworth Vinery, we've got most of Fontaine Vinery, although some of it is still in private hands, and the lower part of it can't be developed until probably quite a lot later because of flooding issues that will have to be tackled, so we're really only talking about the top part. So we've got a few hundred plots to be getting on with, but nowhere near the amount we need, so we are quite desperate to achieve extra sites if we possibly can.
And so would you say there are sufficient brownfield sites either in the state's ownership or that the GHA has to fulfil the 1,000 need, even if they can't all be brought on stream immediately?
No, I think we do need to gain additional sites from the private sector. And of course, we're not sure what public-owned sites we'd like to, or will be allowed to develop. We would love to be able to develop the Cattell Hospital site, for instance, and there are extant plans from the GHA for a significant number of affordable units there. But then I noticed in the hearing you had with PNR, the suggestion was that that sort of development wasn't top of the list, and obviously PNR do have the mandate for states property, so finally it will be their call. I mean, we've very strongly asked to be able to use them. There are other units in states ownership that are, I think, under offer at the moment to be sold off, which could have provided very good key worker housing accommodation in a relatively short time scale and a cost-effective way. So that is a frustration. But at the end of the day, the answer is no. We need to find more sites.
Is it? I mean, you've raised something which I was going to come to later, but I think it's appropriate to talk about it now. Is there a tension, do you think, between the fact that P&R is responsible for property, but your committee and indeed Deputy Summary's committee are responsible for housing, where these two things cross over, and the Cattell Hospital site would be a prime example of that?
I think whoever is responsible for states' properties, there could possibly be a tension, because housing is one potential site of states' properties that aren't going to be used anymore, but I'm sure there might be other states' committees that also have got alternative plans for them. So I'm not against the fact that P&R, I mean, resources, land is a resource, so P&R, it makes a degree of sense for them to be the controlling committee, but with our mandate and our hat on, we have been slightly frustrated that they haven't been prioritising affordable housing on those sites.
Thank you. And what's your committee's view as to whether the GHA should take over the state's housing stock?
We haven't come to a final view on that. In fact, we're due to discuss an interim report on it at our meeting tomorrow. We have no objection in principle. Our focus is very much on, I think there are two criteria here, and ours is very much on what's going to be best for social housing, i.e. for the existing tenants, the quality of their housing, etc., but also what's likely to deliver the most good quality social housing in future. And I think there is a case for saying that actually the GHA model might be able to deliver that better. It's frustrating in a way, because in theory the state should be able to deliver that just as well, but the procedures, the money availability for upgrading and improving thermal insulation, etc., tends to be more laborious to get through the state system than it would be perhaps in the GHA model. The other criterion would be from P&R's point of view largely, which is, of course, they'll get an injection of cash, which will be very useful if they transfer this, but they will be losing the best part of £20 million a year. It's less than that once you net off the spending, but nevertheless, £11–12 million a year net gain, I guess. So they will have to take a judgment about whether it's actually in the financial best interests of the states to do that.
Okay, thank you. And do you believe that the island needs a complementary organisation to the GHA, which allows the states to build houses which are not necessarily in the technical meaning of the affordable housing, but are actually affordable to the majority of the population?
That's an interesting question, and because I do believe that there is, this is my personal view, and it's one that I've asked GHA to look at and our own housing team to look at, that there is almost a cultural wish in Guernsey to be homeowners rather than renting or the sort of leasehold arrangement of partial ownership. And I believe that we could look to extend the range of affordable housing options into one that does actually allow people to wholly own their own starter homes, a bit like we used to under the Home for Workers loan scheme, but with some sort of covenant to make sure that people didn't sort of cash in down the road on that. And that is under active consideration at the moment. I'm sure it will be controversial, because if we use the GHA to deliver that sort of development, we may be seen as standing on the toes of private developers to some extent. But yeah, I believe it might be possible to, for instance, allow people to buy starter homes for about 75% of the commercial valuation by removing the profit element, but making sure that by covenant that subsidy continues from purchaser to purchaser, it goes forward. No decision's been taken on this yet. I'm sure there'll be some counter arguments coming from officers and members of the committee, but it is under active consideration.
Thank you. I think Mr. Lever's got some questions which kind of follow on from this.
They do indeed. Thank you very much, Deputy Burford. Deputy Roffey, how many families or individuals are on the joint waiting list for social housing at the moment?
Well, it's about 500 if you take both the rental and the partial ownership combined, and they are both sort of social housing in the broader sense. So I've looked to officers to give you a precise figure, but it's circa 500. Does anybody have a precise figure?
think it's 327
For rental. Yeah.
for rental, yes, and the rest for partial ownership.
So that's approximately 173 or so for partial ownership on the way.
I mean, I've got in my head that the combined figure is about 500, yeah.
On average, how long do people have to wait on the list?
It's obviously, averages are dangerous things because some people can be catapulted straight to the top of the list if they're going to be homeless. Other people who are not badly housed but inadequately housed may be waiting for a long time. But I think we're certainly partial ownership is painfully long now. I think we're talking about 3 or 4 years, which is why it's not actually being promoted, because it would be almost cruel to promote it. Social housing, the average isn't quite that long, but it is still far longer than it's traditionally been. And I'm looking to the head of operations to see whether he's got an up-to-date figure.
I couldn't give you a number off the top of my head, Andy. But the way the waiting list is designed is it's split up into different categories. So you've got effectively a joint waiting list, which is managed by GHA and housing together, and then people's family circumstances and their requirements dictate which category they go into, and then allocated on that needs basis in order of priority across those 4 categories.
If I could just add to that, there is a couple of areas that are particularly difficult at the moment. One is 1-bedroom ground floor accommodation. We've got a growing number of people with mobility issues or physical impairments that really require that sort of accommodation, and we're short of it. The other is, perversely, because we got actually bucket loads of 3-bedroom houses to the point that we're stopping people transferring down out of them. But we do actually have a shortage of 4-bedroom or 4-bedroom plus for the few very large families. So people are looking for a 4-bedroom house are waiting a particularly long time at the moment.
Thank you.
Could I just come in there, Deputy Roffey, and just ask, you mentioned the potential redesign of Les Genars estate. If that goes ahead, are these the types of issues you're looking to address when you redevelop that site? You mentioned more units. I wondered how many more and what type you're thinking of.
Okay. I think it's something like an 80% gain, so not quite doubling, but 80%. That's not 80% gain in bedrooms, because there will be very much a shift away from the 3-bedroom units, which we've got actually quite a lot of. You know, family sizes have changed over the decades, and the accommodation hasn't changed to reflect that. But about 80% gain in units, although I must stress, because the Genars is a big, and one of its problems is it's a big amorphous estate, is that in redeveloping it, it will very much be split up into areas that with their own distinct character and their own borders, if you like, so that it won't feel like you're living on an estate of hundreds and hundreds of homes. But yes, that's exactly what we're looking to do, and there will be far more 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom units.
I can provide a little bit more granular detail if that would help, just to give an idea of the proportionality between the demand for the different types of units. There's a figure here of just shy of 200 people waiting for a 1-bed accommodation. 2-bed is in the region of 73, 3-bed it's down to 47, and 4-bed it's 21. So that gives you an idea of the scale.
But as I say, because we've got very few 4-bedroom units, although that's a small number, they are having to wait a long time. So when we can get some slack in the system, maybe even more building new 4-bedroom units on GHA developments, or possibly even converting some of the 3-bedroom properties we have now through extensions into 4 bedrooms, or even occasionally 5 bedrooms will be useful.
Thank you.
Broadly speaking, have the figures on the waiting list gone up or down over the last, I've got 2 years here, but if we expanded that period to say 5 years, are they on the rise? Or
They have gone up, yeah. The feeling 2 or 3 years ago is that basically, I mean, we were meeting the targets. The last time the states debated housing targets, which was not directly what was proposed in the KPMG report, but which flowed from that exercise, they set an overall housing target with parameters upper and lower, and they broke that down into social housing and general housing. And we've actually, over that 5-year period, being right at the top end of the target range for the states. And if you'd asked me 3 years ago, I would have said that that appeared to be actually adequately servicing the need. Things were very stable. Of course, people still would like to be housed quicker, but, you know, it was a fairly stable situation. It's really been the last 2.5 years that the problem has worsened very significantly indeed. And it may reflect the fact that the island's population, anecdotally, it's always a year or so behind the actual results, but appears to have gone up fairly significantly as well. So I think we do need to respond by, as your chair said at the beginning, by a significant increase in the number of social housing units.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I ask a couple of supplementaries? Could you just take me through the two figures that you've suggested? You've suggested that we need 1,000 more social houses.
That includes key worker, which is very significant here. There's a very significant demand for key worker housing that's unmet at the moment.
Right, okay, so that includes that. But the figure you've given for numbers on the waiting list is around 500. So that seems to be a large difference in terms of, if we've got 500 on the waiting list, why are we saying we need 1,000 more?
A very big part of that is key worker housing. I mean, if you talk to the HR departments of our big employing departments, and particularly HSC, they're absolutely tearing their hair out. They cannot recruit the type of staff they want, largely because of the unavailability of housing. And whilst some of that might be able to be addressed by bespoke staff accommodation next to the hospital, where it goes as an issue for another day, we know from their HR department there's a significant number of key staff, more mature staff with families who really want to live out in the community, and they don't actually have that option. It would also have a big knock-on effect on the private sector as well, because if we could provide the decent key worker housing, it would then release a lot of what are currently substandard units that are being rented by HSC and other departments out there, which would then be free to hopefully be upgraded, but certainly be available to the local market, the non-social local market, which is also something, it's not our mandate, it's Lindsay's mandate, but, you know, as states members, we are aware that people who don't qualify for social housing are also really struggling to find housing.
So you regard the nursing accommodation as an urgent priority to be done?
Certainly, yeah, absolutely. To the extent that, and of course there is a fourth category. So at the moment we've got social rental, we've got partial ownership, we've got key worker, but we've also got specialist accommodation. So, for instance, one of the next developments that we'll be doing through the GHA as a delivery agent will be down at Sandy Hook. Originally, that was going to be just generally for social housing. HSC pointed out to us they had clients in the Duchess of Kent that had come from, I think, Sunnybrook down at the Cattell, people with adults with learning difficulties. So that also comes under the ambit of affordable and social housing. So it's not just the social rental that we're talking about.
I think there are a few other factors as well that are perhaps relevant. One is that more households are becoming eligible because of the external pressures. Another is, of course, that we need to take into account future projections. And when we're talking about the waiting list, that's the backlog. You know, we need to look to be able to meet the anticipated demand going forward. So it's not just about, you know, chasing a mythical zero waiting list.
Yeah. And finally, I'd like to add, I mean, first of all, let me say that 1,000 is a soundbite. It could be 900, it could be 1,100. I don't know. That was off the top of my head roughly what we need. I would desperately like to liberalise the criteria for eligibility for social housing, because social housing is there for people who can't afford easily, reasonably, to access the private sector. Now, that has expanded. I mean, private rents have gone up, the cost of buying houses has gone up, so there are now more people in Guernsey who can't reasonably afford the private sector. Now, we haven't liberalised the criteria, because what would be the point? When you've got a waiting list of 500 who even more can't afford it, there would be no point in sort of saying that so in terms of sort of how much people are earning in their household circumstances, I would like to broaden the criteria, but at the moment that's just not a sensible thing to do.
You mentioned population there. I'll just pick up on something there. There's a notable pressure, I think, both within the states and perhaps in the business community to increase the population on the island. Do you think a policy which encourages population increase will mean that we're forever playing catch up and we will never actually solve our housing problem?
Well, certainly I hope that, I personally am not one of those that thinks we can solve our demographics by large-scale youthful migration. I think it just pushes it down the road. But that's not, my ESS hat on that's just me as a politician. What I would say with my ESS hat on is if the states do decide they want to do that, I hope they back it up with both the land, and it's not just the money, but the land and the money to really tackle the housing issues that will cause, because we do have a housing crisis now. If we have to cope with a few thousand more people, not all of them, of course, will be wanting social housing. In fact, very few of them may, but it's a displacement. They'll come into a set number of housing units in the island. They'll cause rent inflation, house price inflation. It will displace other people. So if the states do decide to go for this, I really hope that they are responsible enough to say that with that comes a responsibility to provide sites and probably quite a few £1 million to actually tackle the housing issues it would create.
Okay. Back to you, Mr. Laliva.
Yes, it's very difficult asking questions when most of them have been answered in one way or another. But I'd like to go back to the question of underutilised properties, and in fact, the Les Genars in particular, which was built in the 1970s when the demand was for 3-bed housing units for families. Now, I can understand that the sort of restructuring of that estate will make room for some of the 1-bed demand, but is it a suitable estate? And I've got a thing about large estates, as you're probably aware. Is it a suitable estate for increasing it in size, and in particular housing single persons who might be aged or unused to living in what is a very large housing estate?
Yeah, I'm aware that I'm nearly doing all of the talking, so I might pass some of it across. I think if it was just dropping them into the existing estate, then I think that would be problematic. And we know that there are some units in there at the moment where almost non-conforming types of tenants are there and feel a little bit isolated. Although it is surprising the mixture of tenure you can put in. We put some key worker housing into the maisonettes there and actually worked out really quite well. But of course, the idea is to redevelop the whole estate. So I think its very nature will change. We do have sufficient 3-bedroom units elsewhere to take that sort of demand, particularly when we create the 1-bedroom units, because when we create the 1-bedroom units, people are under-occupying the other 3-bedroom units. We'll be able to transfer across, freeing those up. So I think in 10, 15 years' time, if all goes to plan, the Genars will be unrecognisable. And as I said before, it won't be one big amorphous estate. Probably be redeveloped in about 5 different phases, and each phase will almost be like its own close, its own estate, if you know what I mean. But in the transition, will people in phase 1 feel that they're living next to a big, what will remain a big 3-bedroom dominated estate? Yeah, I guess that is a problem. We'll have to work very hard to make sure that's overcome.
Sorry, I would say I think the designs really recognise that concern and reflect it, and I think the mix of use will really help to mitigate it. But as well as you mentioned at the beginning in your question about underutilisation of property, I think there's also something about the inappropriate use of the property. So the property actually just isn't being used in the way that it was designed to be used. So, for example, rooms having been converted, rooms that were originally intended as a dining room, whatever, being used as a bedroom or things like that. So I think we're very conscious of the fact that it's not just about underutilisation, it's about the inappropriate use at the moment, and that's one of the real pressures in terms, driving the need for change.
Thank you. Drifting back, if you like, to the discussions we've had on partial ownership properties, and you've already sort of answered that because we've got 170 on the waiting list and they're waiting 3 or 4 years. Do you know how many partial ownership properties are currently administered by the GHA? An accurate number
That they have.
at the moment?
Yeah, I haven't got that figure off the top of my head. I know that they need a great deal more because there's, as I say, the waiting list is painfully long. What I can say, well, somebody looks up that figure, is that encouragingly we're seeing starting to come through what the whole intention was, far more people staircasing up and moving into the private sector. In fact, we got the GHA quarterly report on our agenda for tomorrow, and it shows by far that last year, 2021, was by far the biggest number of people who sold back to the GHA and moved on into the private sector, which when you consider what house prices were doing last year, is really quite an achievement because it wasn't easy to buy in the private sector. So it is starting to do its job, and I'm whittering on while somebody gets a figure on.
I'm sorry, I don't have the exact figure to hand. I can try and pull it up with a little bit more time, but I think it's certainly just over 1,000 because Clocare opened, that estate was built last year.
GHA have got 1,000 properties.
Oh, sorry.
The question I think was specifically on partial
sorry,
ownership, which is a lot less than
Yes,
that.
sorry, you're quite right.
We've got it here. Wait.
Yeah, about 244, and then special. Yeah, 244.
Yeah, 244, I'm told.
Okay. How many, since the commencement of the partial ownership scheme, I think in 2006 is when it actually became live, how many tenant owners have moved from partial ownership into the owner-occupied sector?
It's accelerating. It's still less than we would have hoped. You have to split between, there's two different people who tend to sell back. One's the model that we always wanted to see. They staircase up, they get to 80%, whatever, they sell back, they use the deposit to buy. The other, sadly, tend to be with marriage breakdowns and where people move out for that reason. But I think not the marriage breakdowns, the classical one, I think last year was 12, I think we've got it. So we're up to about 12 a year now, which is helpful. I mean, we hope that will continue to accelerate. And it's not for everybody. I mean, some people will go into partial ownership intending to always remain in partial ownership. It is a legitimate tenancy option or in its own right, but we are hoping that it will accelerate, and it is, as I say, that all the evidence is that it is doing just that.
And when was a review of the efficacy of the partial ownership scheme last undertaken, or has there ever been one?
I mean, it's under constant review in the sense that we're always talking with the GHA about the various schemes, both the social rental and the partial ownership. And I think it will. You're trying to put something in front of me now.
No, sorry, just relates
and I think
question.
if we look at other tenancy options that I mentioned earlier, which is still embryonic and may or may not come about, I think that the way that interacts and whether it serves a different group, which is the intention to partial ownership, will throw the focus back on that. So I don't think we've sat back in the last couple of years and say, let's bring somebody in to take a particular look at partial ownership, but there's constant questions around the committee table, and particularly along the lines that you were talking about, how often are people moving on and what's happening. Lindsay, you wanted to...
Yeah, I just think one of the pertinent factors is that in the grand scheme of partial ownership schemes, this one hasn't been around for terribly long. So you know, which you know, you want a bit of longevity in order to you know, the longer it's been in place, the easier it is to identify and confirm trends. But
I think somewhere, if I may ask a supplementary question, I think there was a promise in a corporate housing programme report, I'm not absolutely sure of the date, that there was a report would go to the States, or at least would be made public within somewhere in the last decade or so, which hasn't occurred. So that's why my thrust was question was to find out when we might hear.
There was a whole strand of housing work that was commissioned for us to do, and we've had to prioritise it because of resources. And my understanding now, thanks to the note that's been passed to me, is that the review of the partial ownership scheme is going to be a part of what's called the market intervention phase, which has got put back largely because of the housing crisis and the need to focus on immediate provision. The bigger bit of work, which was the strategic housing indicator, is about, I mean, it won't sit under us, we're only the social housing part of that, but it'd be E&I that will bring it forward. But my understanding is that's likely to come forward to the states relatively soon. Various states committees have had a presentation on it. We have, and obviously E&I will have had, I think the DPA have, I think it's going to P&R next week. So I don't know if Lindsay, when you can say where that works. So this is sort of the next one from KPMG 5 or 6 years on, but
I can't say exactly when, but it's very much a work in progress. And as Deputy Roffey rightly says, it's doing the sort of consultation rounds or the information rounds and seeking views of other committees, which we're most of the way through.
Thank you. And given that during the 90-year life of the Home for Workers loan scheme, some 4,000 or so islanders were granted direct access to home ownership, do you believe that the current partial ownership scheme offers a realistic and effective route into the owner-occupied sector when compared with its predecessor?
I do think it offers a realistic route into private ownership. I personally regret the passing of the Home for Workers loan scheme. I think it got changed to the States loan scheme towards the end, although I quite like the non-politically correct name it had before. I declare an interest. I was one of the beneficiaries. That's how I got onto the housing ladder, through a Home for Workers loan. However, that the monies that had been accumulated over the decades in that didn't get dissipated. They got put into the sort of the housing fund and spent. And I think trying to recreate a Home for Workers loan scheme now would be incredibly difficult. It would need to sort of build up over many years. So I think actually trying to focus on what we got and make it work well is probably the right way forward at this time.
Okay, sort of answered my next question, but given the depth and extent of previous housing crises, in particular post-1918 and 1945, when very significant levels of states funding alone helped thousands of islanders into the owner-occupied sector, do you think that the current level of capital investment by the GHA and the states is sufficient to provide decent and desirable accommodation to meet not only the needs of low-income families, but also those with incomes just slightly shy of obtaining a commercial loan?
No. That takes us back to the question that was asked right at the beginning about the fact that I think we need to expand provision. Because it does come down to supply and demand at the end of the day. If there's not enough units for the number of people that are demanding those units, then you need to create more, much though I feel the island's overdeveloped in many ways. And you're right about the 1980s. I lived through that, and it was, in some ways, that housing crisis was worse than the one we had now. The press was constantly full of people sleeping in cars, sleeping in vans, doing whatever. And even though the island had no money at the time because the growing sector was in sort of terminal decline, they did actually prioritise housing and put an awful lot of cash into it. And I think that there is a need to do. A shelter is just such a basic provision that we will damage our economy if we don't. We will lose people from the island if we can't provide a reasonable amount of housing for them. So I will continue to be making the case very much certainly for the grant funding of sites. I do believe that the GHA model means that they'll be able to commercially borrow from the bond or wherever they choose to borrow and service the cost of construction through the rent roll. But the actual sites, I think we need to invest in, and they need to be there. I mean, it's the DPA can say there's lots of sites that they've earmarked for housing. That's no good if every time somebody actually applies to do something on them, that same DPA turn around and say, for traffic reasons, we're not going to allow anything to happen on that particular site. So it is a frustration that usable sites are in short supply at the moment.
Having asked my previous question, which indeed copied one that you answered before, I'm going to put it yet another way, possibly plainer. Put another way, is there the possibility that the states and the GHA, either separately or jointly, could devise a scheme that offered a direct route to owner occupation, in effect missing out the partial ownership scheme and making people wait 3 or 4 years to get onto a scheme which...
I refer the right honourable gentleman to the answer I gave some time ago. I think there is a way. whether it, and I know that the board of the GHA have discussed it. My board haven't yet discussed the pros and cons, and it would be basically building houses that were sold at the full cost, but without the developer profit and with a covenant attached to make sure that the owners didn't sort of cash in on that down the road, that it could only ever be sold at that percentage of market value. But so that is a possibility, but it's not one that has yet been determined whether we want to move ahead. And if we do, we'd probably have to, I think we'd probably need to take it to the States. It would be such a major departure from the current suite of sort of affordable housing schemes that I think we would need the States to discuss it.
Can I ask a question there? Partial ownership locks in at 80%. Have you considered allowing the scheme to go to 100% so that the tenants can buy out and become private owners, which is what people tend to want to do?
No, because I think that would stop the circulation of those particular properties being available for new people wanting to join the scheme. However, we have made clear to the GHA that we're very happy for them to extend it to 90%, so that final step when they're moving into the private sector is more manageable. I can't remember whether they've decided to do that or not, but from our point of view, as the state sort of giving instructions, we don't object to that happening at all. Yeah. Lindsay, sorry.
It's called staircasing, that, and it was covered in some detail in the policy letter that went to the States on housing last time, I think 2018, and certainly the significant, I think, staircasing up close to 100% is really good because it makes that jump into the private market easier, potentially. But the problem, as Deputy Roffey says, is once you relinquish that stock from your assets, it sets you back. You know, it actually creates more problems than you're fixing. So it has been covered. It has. I think the answer to your question is that it has been considered certainly by E&I as well as ESS, and the view of both those committees at the point that it was considered in some detail because of the KPMG report and other things was that going all the way to 100% would not be a particularly good idea.
I understand that the Housing Action Group was a short-term working party of 1 year and it's going to be winding up soon. In your opinion, would it be beneficial to keep it going?
I'm not sure. We will actually be having a public presentation of the Housing Action Group later this week, so you can ask that question there where I got the other members. I think there is almost a misconception amongst some States members, including even some members of ESS, over the role of HAG. I mean, HAG is not an executive body. It is, basically, we were aware that the way the States mandates work, the sort of the mandates that impinge on the housing crisis are split up. You know, E&I have the general housing mandate, we have the social housing mandate, even though the two obviously interrelate strongly in the marketplace. DPA have the planning mandate, P&R have got the LUCA, and well, not much of it apparently, but and so the idea was to try and bring all of those bodies together to make sure that we were hopefully pulling in the right direction and giving the biggest bang for our buck. Whether that's always worked, we can discuss when we have the HAG presentation. I think it has been a benefit. I think the rapid purchase of Kenilworth Vinery was facilitated very much through the Housing Action Group. In other areas, there's been some tensions. For instance, the best ways to tackle key worker housing, I think we haven't sort of necessarily always had a meeting of minds, and that's the nature of politics. You won't always have a meeting of minds. If it was to be extended, I think it would be not beyond the end of this year. It is. There comes a time when you have to just say to the committees, stay in contact with each other, make sure you're trying to work in a common direction, but constant working groups, you know, we set up lots of them. If they don't fall away at some stage, we would all be on about 8 working groups. So my own personal view, you're not allowed an opinion, are you? But you probably observe it, Ed, better than most of us, is that, yes, I think a short extension might be worthwhile to see through some of the policy issues that are yet to be discussed. but we're talking about months and not years, I think.
Of course, the committee mandates that, you know, the split over the mandates isn't going to change. So you're going to move away from having a group where you get together to talk about it to hoping you just kind of work together when necessary.
I wouldn't say that we would never get together as presidents or members. I think that happens all the time. You know, you have joint meetings between committees to sort of say, how do we take this forward? But whether it's like a working group is different. It has officers working to it, it has a regular meeting date, it has papers produced, and I'm not. At some stage, you have to decide how you use the resource most efficiently. And I think bringing us together to say, "Oi, we've got a real problem here. How we're going to tackle it," had a purpose. But I'm not sure to do that for 4 or 5 years would be the best use of resources.
Clearly, you think that the Kenilworth Vinery purchase was a high point of the HAG operation. Have you got any others that you can report on?
Well, I think the HAG is split into, again, I'll have more time to expand upon this later in the week maybe, but it's split into 2 big areas. One is actually finding sites, new sites, and Kenilworth, to be honest, is the only large new site that we have gained through that process. Yes, there's the Fontaine Vinery or what's it going to be called now? I've forgotten. They've given a new name to it. But anyway, that was already really in play and was always going to be that way. It helped us focus on some of the infills we might do on state sites. But the other side of it is the policy issue, because it's not all about sites. So things like, should there be incentives to downsize? Because we know that in Guernsey there's probably enough bedrooms that just aren't distributed in the right way. Should there be incentives to bring forward developments that already got permission or already got outline permission or whatever? And by incentives, I mean both carrots and sticks, so maybe taxes, maybe incentives. A lot of these sit with P&R. That's the bit that we're sort of doing now. How much is going to come out of that? We'll see. You know, should there be incentives to develop accommodation above commercial shops in town? Should there be? Well, there's also should we have rent control? I'm not saying we should. I'm just saying these are sort of policy issues we moved on to. So we are still focused on finding new sites. And as I said earlier, I think we desperately need more sites still. But it's now sort of in phase 2, which is the policy side of it.
I did pressure on that because, of course, the public won't be able to tune into your hearing later in this week.
So that is for states members, absolutely. No, I'm not objecting at all to. I think housing is probably the biggest issue facing the island, almost. So, the more often I can speak about it, the better, really.
Yeah. With just a final point before I hand over to Deputy Dyke, with Kenilworth. Can you put a figure, if any, on what you think GP11 saved the states in terms of the purchase of that site?
Yeah. Let's see. It was about 6 million purchase. It would have been about 30% provision. So there was somewhere between £1.5 and £2 million, I would say.
I think just for clarity for those who are watching the live stream, that GP11 is a policy in the Island Development Plan which dictates that a percentage of developments over 20 units should be put to social housing. Yeah,
I think more. Well, there's 2 sides. It would have been more expensive without GP11 because you have a payment per plot, but factored into that valuation was whatever it was, 30% of plots that came cost-free. My bigger concern would be we might not have bought it at all. P&R may have balked at the price of the valuation without GP11 and said, sorry, we can't. I'm not saying that would have happened, but there's a realistic possibility because it would have been a lot more expensive.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Dyke, you have some questions now, I think, on a different subject.
Yeah, thank you. You've answered some of them already, but my main question is carrying on with GP11. Once any site that is suitable for more than 20 houses has to put a proportion to social housing, and over 30 houses we're at 30%. So what you do have, would you not agree, a rather large tax on the development of private housing to buy, which must have pushed up prices of those homes to the levels we're seeing now.
I disagree with that. I don't think you have a tax on building houses to buy. I think you have a tax on the planning gain that the landowners get, because what will happen is the developer, just as we did with Kenilworth Vinery, will buy those sites at a lower price, factoring in that into the valuation. So unless a builder's been land banking land for a long time, in which case they've owned it, if they're buying land to develop, it will not be a tax on their development.
I think you're misunderstanding the economics there. If your developer has to develop 30% of the site as social housing and only 70% as private housing, it begins to make the projects unviable, and that's what we've seen. We haven't seen
paid less for the land as
but
a
we've
result.
seen, yes, but the projects become more and more expensive for the developer and or the private house buyer, and I mean the evidence of this is we've seen no developments built that have been subject to GP11 since it was introduced. So would your committee not consider reviewing how we should handle this?
We're always happy to look how we can handle it, but I think the cost to the states, given that where we were before about we need a lot more social housing units, which means more plots available for them, the cost will skyrocket to the states if we look to simply do away with this sort of provision. You say that nothing's been built, and that's true. The larger sites were also the more complex ones that were likely to come forward later. We know that Point Rock were willing to take that hit and move forward. They were turned down for traffic reasons, but that's, you know, there may be valid traffic reasons. I'm not saying they're not, but it wasn't because of GP11 they wouldn't do it. My understanding also is there are other large sites that are in the wings, but we are getting told that, you know, a lot of people are just saying, we're going to hold off on this. We hear Deputy Dyke and others saying, we're likely to do away with GP11. Who in their right minds in those circumstances would develop now when they can maximise the value of the site they own if they hold back and think that it's going to, going to have added value if the states do away with GP11?
Yeah, well, perhaps we should get on with it. With regard to the Point Rock site, that actually does raise another question. I'm on development and planning. And what we saw there was an incredibly densely designed development in the middle of an area of housing which was much more spacious in terms of area. Extreme local opposition, largely because of the density. And I would put it to you that part of the density issue is because of the 30% social housing requirement. To make the thing economic, you have to crush more in. You crush more in, and then you have what the rest of the committee thought was a traffic problem. So it's another development from GP11 is more densely packed housing if you're going to get it at all.
But to be fair, I think the DPA is simply encouraging, and I know I can't answer for the DPA, you can, you sit on it, but I think your officers are encouraging dense development and because they want to maximise land use because they know that there's a limited amount of land in Guernsey. I didn't sit on that and I didn't look at the plan, so I have no idea whether the traffic objections may have been absolutely valid, but I can tell my Vice President is gagging to come in on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I am familiar with the feedback that planning application got. And I would say that the problem is not housing density. The problem is quite specifically transport density, which is related to our current transport paradigm, which just doesn't scale well. So it actually, that is what causes puts the pressure on the supporting infrastructure. That is what creates the real life tangible problems for residents in the area. You know, I've spoken with people who live in the area who even though they live maybe 200 or 300 metres from Delancey Park, don't feel it's safe enough to walk their children to the park. You know, they feel that they need to drive them there and that kind of thing. So it very much is transport density or vehicle density as opposed to housing density, which is the problem. In fact, housing density in and of itself is a beneficial thing because it makes communities more livable. So it is the transport density, the vehicle density associated under the current transport paradigm with the housing units that is putting the pressure on the surrounding infrastructure and creating much of that tension with the extant resident community.
We're probably going beyond the mandate of ESS, but I think that traffic issues in Guernsey, and particularly in the north of the island, need to be tackled head on, because that's where most of the areas earmarked for housing actually are. So if we're going to have Beals Yard, and I keep hearing that could be very soon, that planning application comes forward. If we're going to have Kenilworth Vinery, and Point Rock may not have disappeared, may well come back to you, I imagine, in some form. If we're going to have the Franquief, if we're going to have Fontaine Vinery, the logic is that they should all get turned down because in that area has got dense traffic. I know not the small roads that were around Point Rock, I accept that, but I do think the states will need to actually tackle traffic issues head on, but that's really not a matter for ESS. What I would say about GP11 is it's the DPA's policy, it's not our policy. They brought it to the states, they got it approved. My understanding is, you were talking about viability, that it has absolute wriggle room in it, that if it can be proven, not just said, that a development is rendered unviable by the allocation, that can be reduced or waived. So it is entirely in the DPA's hands to do that. What I would say is that personally, I would like it to stay. And I would like a firm commitment from the DPA that it will stay in the long term, because I think that will release development. But if it's going to go, get rid of it quickly, because that gives certainty as well. Because this uncertainty, this big question mark hanging over it, is just constipating the whole development field, really, because people are waiting to see. Well, it's human nature. I don't blame them. They're waiting to see whether they can get betterment further down the road. But if it does go, bear in mind, we were going to need considerably, many millions of pounds more to grant from the GHA to purchase sites for social housing, because their valuation will go up.
Although perhaps you should take into account that if the sites are developed with all private housing, that will reduce the amount of demand for social housing, because more people will be accommodated.
Well, any units that were developed, I mean, it's not. There are two markets, of course, but they're absolutely interrelated. I mean, the more people that are accommodated in one, it takes the pressure off the other. So, to be honest, you're right. But however many private houses you build, unless the cost of purchase or the cost of rental comes down significantly, we know that there are many people in the island that won't be able to afford that. And so it's not going to do away with the need for social housing units.
Right, thank you very much. All of my other questions you've answered earlier, so that we can go on to Simon.
Yeah, so Deputy Fairclough, just a few questions before we have a break.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask one, just before we move on from housing, just about emergency housing, if I may. It's a topical issue. I don't know whether you saw the report last night on the news about it. It was a story about homelessness in Guernsey, and there was a quote from the States of Guernsey saying it needs a holistic look at what the current emergency housing provisions are in Guernsey, where the gaps are, what structure it should take, who should deliver this, and how it links in with the wider affordable housing spectrum. What action is being taken on the Housing Action Group, or indeed by your committee, to address emergency housing?
Yeah. Not a lot at the moment, to be honest, and I think it is a gap that needs to be addressed. At the moment, ESS doesn't have a mandate to do emergency housing at all. The only emergency housing the states do is really St Julian's House, which comes under HSC, and then there's the private sector like Sarnia Housing, etc. In an ideal world, we wouldn't be in a position where we have to deal with emergency housing. We would be tackling it upstream, but the reality is I think we do need emergency housing. I've lived through this in the 80s. It is really quite difficult because you only have emergency housing available for homelessness if you leave those units empty in the normal course of events. So you have people who are actually quite a desperate need of housing because they're living in inadequate accommodation, saying, why can't I have that unit over there that's empty because it's better than what I've got now? But if you allow them to do that, then the next person is genuinely homeless and got nowhere to go. You've filled up your emergency housing. And I know the GHA would, if stock transfer goes ahead, or even if it doesn't, are quite interested in looking to offer the states the ability that they could do some provision in this area as well. But I mean, the honest answer is yes. I think we do need to look at emergency housing, and whether it will come under ESS, whether it will come under GHA, whether it will stay under HSC, I don't know. But there is a need to do that.
But you accept that that's something that needs picking up by the states and quickly?
Yeah. Yes, I do, yeah.
Thank you. I'd just like to move on.
Just on the quickly, the trouble is we do have limited resources. People are demanding that the very small team relating to housing do absolutely everything at the same time, and it does become quite impossible. So I think that if the states want us to cover all of these things, market intervention, social housing, whatever, all at one time, they will need to find extra resources to allocate to us, because we do not have, sitting with an EHS, the people that will be able to do all of this inside the next few months.
Thank you, Deputy Roffey. If we've got time to move on to benefits before the break. Just a couple of questions on benefits, if I may. Deputy Roffey, again, you highlighted last October how key workers such as nurses are turning down offers of employment because of prohibitively high housing costs, and we've heard a bit of that this morning. What, if any, plans or ideas do the committee have to overcome that critical issue?
I don't think that's so much through benefits. That would be far more through the key worker housing initiatives. I don't think we would expect key workers being recruited and coming in to fill crucial jobs, with the exception maybe of care, who at the moment care workers aren't designated as key workers, but I think everybody is regarding them as key workers. But, sort of senior nurses or whatever, which is the type of people I was talking about, wouldn't probably be eligible for benefits. But I think what we would like to see is sufficient key worker housing developed, because it is really frustrating. A lot of money and effort is going into recruiting people who want to come and work in Guernsey. They come across and they just say, no, it's 60-70% of my income is going to go on if I want the sort of housing that I want, which isn't always, they're not all 21 and wanting to live in a one-bedroom flat above the shop at the PEH. A lot of them want a more normal existence. They're going away again, and I know that's incredibly frustrating, but I think key worker housing rather than benefits is the response there.
And in November 2021, your committee decided to suspend the income limits applied to people living in social housing, meaning that employed people living in social housing can earn freely without putting their tenancy at risk. You stated this change was an interim step after examining ways it could support employers in response to the current labour shortage, and that the social housing income limits would be suspended until the end of this year. Do you believe that change has been successful?
Anecdotally, yes, we believe that. I mean, we don't get the data, so we don't know if somebody has taken on extra hours working in a supermarket because before they were worried it was going to put their tenancy in jeopardy, and it no longer does. We've heard a few anecdotal stories suggesting that it's been helpful. It is something we're going to have to resolve going forward, because there is a real dichotomy. The last thing we want to do, particularly with a labour shortage, is stop people having ambition, stop people looking for a promotion, stop people taking on extra hours in particular, or going out to work full-time maybe when because they've been a parent of young children, they've only worked part-time. But at the same time, there has to be some kind of limit. It would be perverse for the states to be providing a suite of housing for people who can't reasonably afford the private sector, and to accommodate indefinitely people who are really quite high earners and patently could afford the private sector. So trying to get that policy right, where you're not stifling ambition, but you are making sure that the housing is being used for the people that need it most, is quite a difficult balancing act. And I think we're due to have a paper fairly soon on where we go at the end of this year.
This year, and because the policy at the moment is only extended up to the end of this year, so we've got to get some messaging out about what's going to happen from 2023.
Yeah.
And did you want to come in, Andy? Sorry.
I was just asked supplementary. When you reinstate those the existing limits,
We may not do that. We will look at the limits and see what we are going to do. Yeah.
Okay, but whatever you do, what happens to those tenants who've permanently improved their circumstances? How do you cast them out into the private sector, or pass them over to the GHA?
First, no. The GHA is subject to the same criteria now as we are. We have joint criteria, so that wouldn't help them at all. I think my own personal view, and we haven't yet discussed this, is that the new limits will have to be more liberal than the last lot, because some people will have. It'd be perverse if somebody's taking on extra hours, or, to take my supermarket example, has taken the supervisor's job because they know they can now, to suddenly sort of say you're out in the streets because of that. So I think we will probably have to build in some headroom, and even when people are over that, the process isn't you're pack up, you're going. It's sort of you've got a year or two to look for, accommodation in the private sector. The trouble is, trying to find private rental at the moment is so difficult that it feels particularly harsh, even if people are above the limit, to say, go and sort yourself out elsewhere, because we know even people on quite high earnings are finding it really hard to find private rental accommodation. So all of those those facts will have to be taken into account.
Especially if they're a family with a large number of dependent children. They will be protected, presumably, to some degree.
We haven't yet discussed the policy, but I very much take on board the points that you're making. Yeah.
Thank you.
Further questions on that?
Really, just when are you expecting that policy to come forward?
Really in the next month, I hope. But I'm looking at, obviously we're looking to the officers to draw up a paper, even though we have our own ideas. So I'll look to the Director of Operations.
Yeah, but it's like you say, it's due the Q2, I think. It's at some stage during Q2. So the committee, as I said, we will have to go out with some communication, because we can't leave it too long for tenants in that position to understand what the requirements are going to be from 2023, because it will affect their own planning.
But it comes a bit back to what I mean. There are two sets. There's criteria for accessing social housing, and then there's a more generous set of criteria for when you have to leave. And exactly as I said to you earlier, that ideally I would like to make the criteria for access more liberal, because the private sector has become so much more unaffordable. I think we need to bear that in mind when we're looking at the criteria for people that are already in social housing, about at what point of income do you expect them to move on.
Right, thank you. We'll take a short break, I think, at this point, and if we can reconvene, please, at 11:10. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everybody. So we'll restart this second half with Deputy Murray, who has questions on the discrimination ordinance.
Deputy Ruffy, if I may, your committee's obviously received responses to the draft discrimination proposals from a number of stakeholders. The response from the Confederation of Guernsey Industry did draw attention to the original proposals for comprehensive equal status and fair treatment legislation brought by ANF in 2003. It's been a long time. And it stated that the states needed to be mindful that any legislative measures must be both appropriate and proportionate to the bailiwick circumstances. More specifically, and if you'll allow me an opportunity to give you context, in paragraph 27, the committee stresses that legislation will only be proposed after the most thorough analysis of the perceived grounds of discrimination and, most importantly, the social and economic consequences of such legislation. In particular, the states must be able to take into account whether Guernsey's economy or the well-being of any sector of the economy or public finances would be adversely affected by such legislation. So this was effectively the genesis of the proposals that your committee now intends to bring to the states this term. It's been a long journey with a number of stops and starts, but I think it's important that we do gauge what is now proposed within the context of what was originally intended. Which, in short, is such legislation must first have thoroughly researched the incidence of discrimination and be proportionate in terms of its response to Guernsey circumstances. Therefore, I think it would be helpful in terms of determining the incidence of discrimination if you could advise us what work the committee has undertaken in light of the fact that your predecessor, Deputy Clerk, comments in the foreword of the draft discrimination proposals published in 2019, whilst we do not have a study which quantifies the rate of discrimination, we do have evidence that it happens in Guernsey. Now, unfortunately, to my knowledge, the only published evidence of discrimination is contained in the very recent 2021 Citizens' Advice Report, where it was stated that out of 11,875 inquiries, 39 were in respect of discrimination. Now, whilst any discrimination is, of course, absolutely regrettable, that would suggest a very small incidence exists locally and could not possibly be the driver for complying with the original intent that legislation be proportionate. Therefore, could you advise us what other local studies or metrics exist which do in fact justify the extensive draft proposals?
Okay, preface my remark by saying that I find it extraordinary that in some quarters people find this as sort of controversial or cutting edge, because actually Guernsey, in proposing what is a very much a box standard set of anti-discrimination legislation, is right at the back of the pack of just about any developed country in bringing forward these sort of measures. It is really difficult to measure the amount of discrimination that goes on in the absence of any remedies existing for people to come forward. You're quite right that the Citizens Advice Bureau do tell us, and they tell us on a regular basis, that they have a number of complaints, and a rising number of complaints of different forms of discrimination, but expecting people to come forward and actually volunteer the fact that they're being discriminated against when there's absolutely no remedy is almost impossible. But the point I would make is that if the level of discrimination is relatively low, the island has absolutely nothing to fear from this legislation, nor do employers and nor do service providers. On the contrary, if there is a significant level of discrimination, then I think it is the state's duty to put in place the sort of remedies that exist. Indeed, we have international obligations that we're failing to discharge at the moment. We signed up about 50 or 60 years ago to the UN Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which insists that we have to have a legal remedy, and actually none exists, and therefore, we are absolutely in breach of that. And is it proportionate? I think the fact that all the leading employer groups have come out recently and saying they do, and they may have a question mark over, the exact implementation date, but saying that they had very significant concerns, maybe about my predecessor's first straw man proposals that drew heavily on the Irish and Australian legislation, but that what we're putting forward now they think is sound, and that they're encouraging the states to get on, maybe with a short delay, but to get on and implement it, suggests that I think it is proportionate. But if you're waiting for exact figures about how many people are being discriminated against in Guernsey, what you're supposed to produce in the vacuum of people not being able to come forward for a remedy, I think you'll be waiting forever, to be honest, because I don't think it's practical to achieve that.
So you're not really sure? basically, at the end of the day?
No, of course I'm not sure. And I don't think it's possible to be sure. I don't think any country that brought in this sort of legislation was sure before they brought it in how much discrimination would be unearthed. I suspect culturally we are closest to Jersey. When Jersey brought in their legislation, they did have an early burst of quite a number of cases. It settled down because the intent of the legislation is not to have lots of tribunals. It is to mainly to have a cultural change to make sure that employers and service providers understand what discrimination is and avoid discriminating, so that we don't actually have those sort of tribunals required. So if it proves to be a damp squib, we'll have done our job properly in the education and the cultural change we're trying to bring about. Sorry. Although she introduced herself as committee secretary, my committee secretary also did an awful lot of the foundation work in her previous role on this legislation, so she'll probably be better informed than me on it, because I'm a relative newcomer to the committee.
Just to say, the experience of discrimination in Guernsey is described in the committee's policy letter that was debated by the States in July 2020. I refer you to section 3.4, which provides the evidence that we have, notwithstanding the points that Deputy Roffey makes around it being difficult to measure something that you have no legal remedy against, and therefore why would somebody sort of report an issue if they can't actually do anything about it? So yeah, there are various case studies and examples and statistics set out in that section of the policy letter, which was debated before you were in the States. So I can send you a copy of that. But for example, the Guernsey Disability Alliance published a report in 2013 called Islands of Equality or Oceans of Exclusion, and that set out a number of personal examples that people with disabilities had experienced. Channel Television, ITV, undertook a survey in 2018 and that showed that 36% of islanders with disabilities felt that their condition meant that they had been unfairly treated by others.
Because in terms of proportionality, 36% of a proportion is a number. Yes. What would that number actually represent, do you think?
So the Disability Needs Survey, which was carried out probably about a decade ago, indicated sorry, let me just flip to the right statistic. About 1 in 5 people in Guernsey have a disability, so about 14,000 individuals.
I think I do recall that actual survey that was undertaken at that stage was about 783 people. It was in 2 parts. That was the first part. And the individuals were actually asked a series of questions, which actually, when it was actually published, was prefaced with the suggestion that not many people would actually expect what was being described here as actual disability. And then those 783 respondents or whatever, and I think it was about 300 in the second, that was simply extrapolated up to the size of the population to give you what you're saying, which is approximately 14,000 in the bailiwick, which I would suggest is probably shaky, frankly, at this point in time.
I'm not sure.
But I mean, it does concern me that obviously we are using a relatively small proportion of the population to extrapolate a very large percentage of apparent disabled people. I mean, for example, at the moment, could I ask, or would you know?
It would not be out of line with the percentage of other Western populations that are deemed to have a disability. I mean, we're not talking necessarily about people in wheelchairs. We're talking about people with mobility issues, hearing issues, sight issues. Very much as we have an ageing population that is, because as you become elderly, you tend to have diminishing abilities, as it were.
No, but, yeah. Understood. I mean, do you have, for example, at the moment today, an indication, if you like, of how many people are receiving some form of disability allowance at this stage?
Disability allowances for very severe disabilities, but Ed would be the one that would be most likely.
Well, that's okay. I'll leave you time to do at this point. If I could just move on then perhaps more to the financial implications. So staying with the original intent that any proposals be thoroughly researched in terms of not just the incidents, but the economic consequences, committee member Deputy Steve Fuller very recently was interviewed on Channel Television. And he was asked to comment on the suggestions from GPEG, the organisation I'm sure you're aware of, who had estimated that employers might have to find £250,000 per year to implement the proposals, which, in their words, could have a devastating effect on small business. Deputy Fuller said that whilst he could not say whether this was a valid estimation of costs, he would be surprised if that was of that order of magnitude. And following discussions with the business community, he did not expect that there would be that level of costs. But when asked what he would therefore expect a small business to pay, Deputy Fowler said it was impossible to say. However, when he was pressed, Deputy Fowler said it's never been about cost. It's about ensuring that there isn't discrimination in the workplace. Now, that would suggest that, contrary to the intention to research and deliver proportionate legislation for Guernsey, either no such research has actually been done, or the committee doesn't deem that costs are relevant. So perhaps you could again advise us of any research to which you can ascertain the cost of business, so that we can have confidence on the economic consequences of enabling this legislation, and that it's not simply the intent to enact it regardless.
Firstly, I'll answer your previous question. I think there's 800 current claims for severe disability, but that doesn't mean that there's only 800 people that are, have a disability in Guernsey. But that's
and there are also 950 in receipt of long-term sickness benefit.
So it's quite a way away from 14,000.
yes, well,
That's the severe.
exactly. That most of these people were not meant to make claims. In fact, it's the very fact that most of them are actually going to be, hopefully, in the workforce, being productive members of our community, that makes this legislation imperative, because it actually takes away barriers for them actually doing that. Coming back to, I must admit, I was in Sri Lanka and I missed all of Mr. Fowler's comments, so I'm hearing them for the first time here. I think we think the GPEG have constantly taken a almost perversely negative view on this legislation. The cost to good employers should be absolutely minimal, because they will not be expected to do anything that they're not doing now. We did look at doing the possibility of doing what would be a really expensive consultancy to look at the overall economic impact, because that was asked of us at one stage. To be honest, I don't believe the results would have been believed by anybody, however they came out, or really influenced the outcome. And larger communities like North America and the US and the UK have done these studies about the impact of very similar legislation, and it ranges from very marginally negative to fairly significantly positive for the economy, in the sense that there are actual more gains than there are more than costs, and we don't see any reason to believe that Guernsey would be any different to that. So the idea of spending what might have been many hundreds of thousands of pounds getting a detailed, because a Heath Robinson exercise would not have satisfied anybody. A really detailed exercise done seemed pointless, because we don't think that Guernsey is unique. It's unique in some ways, but not in this particular respect. So if you want me to give exact pounds and pence how much it's going to cost employers, I can't do that, but I do not believe it will be anything other than modest. Proportionality is absolutely shot through this legislation. There are all, it's a bit like the EU and straight bananas. There are all sorts of false sort of stories being sort of circulated about what employers would be expected to do, in particular small employers, and how they're going to afford this. If it's not proportionate, it won't have to happen. I really think that there is a lot of frightening of the horses going on, and the reality, just like in Jersey, and this law is quite similar to Jersey's, I'm not picking up from the employers over there, God, our competitiveness is really at odds, has really been damaged by this. It's fear of change, I think. I don't actually think there will be any big impact on commerce at all.
Well, thank you for that. The reality being then that we are just assuming that it will mimic or be similar to another jurisdiction. I think my concern there would be that primarily you're talking about comparing legislation which we've created, which has no case law, which has no precedent, with existing legislation, for example, in the UK, where there is history, and which has a completely different complexion, if you like, in terms of social composition and economy. So they're not actually alike.
Can I just correct that? I mean, obviously, we consult with the law officers and the drafting of this. They are absolutely confident that our law is similar enough to the UK and other similar pieces of legislation, that case law will be able to be used wholesale in local tribunals, that it will not be a question of starting from scratch.
But that would have not been the reason why you wouldn't have accepted perhaps the Jersey legislation, which had already been in place, which we could have imported and adapted?
I think it's very similar, what we're putting forward to the Jersey legislation. We obviously couldn't just have copied it. You talked about the 15-year journey or whatever it's been from 17 years from 2005. One of the first groups that were promised some type of protection was the carer status. Jersey's law doesn't impact on carers at all. It's not a protected characteristic in Jersey, so we couldn't just have copied their law. But I think mainly driven by strange narrative that GPEG's put out, a lot of people are talking about this law as if it was still the first draft of the law from 2 or 3 years ago, where it was, admittedly, for the best of reasons and trying to improve on existing legislation, had quite a few novel features. Largely, those have now been removed, and it is very much akin to both the UK and Jersey law.
Can I step in there for a moment? You say it's akin to Jersey law, but I'm not really sure that's correct. I mean, there are two issues that have been pointed out. I'm not sure whether, I think it was GPEG for one of them and GFSE for another. The definition that we have in this draft law that we have covers pretty much everyone in Guernsey. You could define every single person in Guernsey as disabled under this current definition that we have. If you look to the Jersey one, it's rather different. And the other big point that hangs over every business like a sword of Damocles are the eye-watering penalties and claims for damages, which are way in excess of what they are in Jersey.
Many of our penalties are actually lower than in the UK, and
Comparisons with Jersey, which is our major competitor, as the GFSC have pointed out.
I'll get that looked up, but I certainly don't think we're out of kilter with that. As for the definition of disability, it is just absolute. I mean, I talked about straight bananas before. Absolute urban myth that just about everybody will be able to be described as, or be able to claim the protected grounds of disability. That is not the case. And you have to remember, anyway, even if it were, which it's not, it's only when discrimination actually takes place on the grounds of disability that any offence is taken place. So it is the discrimination that is the key point here.
Can I just then ask Deputy Ruffy, because clearly, you know, we haven't done any specific surveys, or we haven't got any specific information on financial impact at this point in time. We're making assumptions, rightly or wrongly, at this point.
Yeah, we have obviously spoken to employer groups and welcome their impact, and as I say, they are very much supportive of this legislation.
But what I have to wonder then is, in July last year, 2020, Deputy Trott made a comment. Now, Deputy Trott at that point, as far as I'm aware, was probably our Chancellor at that stage, I think, if you can remember that. And he suggested, and I think this is probably in terms of equal pay for equal value work, he was making the suggestion that the states, as the island's largest employer, obviously paid for by taxpayers, that the cost of the proposals would add a staggering £50 million to the cost of the public sector purse.
It won't add anything. It won't add a penny.
And that didn't include the pension contributions. So you either disagree with that, and if you disagree with that, you've got figures to the contrary, or he actually made it up.
Well, he didn't, but he conflated two different issues. What he was talking about, first of all, was equal pay for work of equal value, which does not form a part of the proposals coming to the states.
Not this year.
No, and not in this political term, in fact. But even then, when it is equal pay for work of equal value, the only thing that's actually going to come forward as part of this legislation, probably in the next term, will be gender-related, which is a fairly narrow definition. What he was talking about was a commitment that apparently the PNR in the last term made, I think, particularly to nursing unions, but maybe to others as well, that the states would bring in equal pay for work of equal value. And that's totally separate to this law. If this law is voted out, that pledge is still there and will still be worked towards. And it seems that perversely, their only way of doing it was to actually increase the pay of the relatively underpaid with no suggestion of holding back the pay of the relatively overpaid. And I think that that is just an utterly unaffordable way to go about trying to create equal pay for work of equal value. I have been chair of a very large Channel Islands employer with who introduced equal pay for work, equal value, and it absolutely involved holding back the pay of the relatively well paid, because we wouldn't have survived in the commercial world if all we'd done was the opposite, uplifting, because the world's competitive. So with great respect to my colleague Deputy Trott, I think he was talking moonshine in respect of this particular law. Yeah, Ellen.
And that will need to be the subject of another policy letter that comes to the States. So equal pay for work of equal value will need to be looked at as a policy issue in its entirety, and then proposals brought to the States if the committee decides to do that. That's phase 2B in the government work plan. So we're implementing phase 1 at the moment. Phase 2 is scheduled for the policy work to commence next year, and that's around introducing age discrimination legislation and taking the provisions from our current sex discrimination ordinance, reviewing them and bringing them into the overall discrimination ordinance. And then, so that's sort of pegged for this term of government. And then phase 2B is equal pay for work of equal value, which, like I say, would be the next term, which obviously
But
would
only in
depend.
relation to sex.
Only in relation to sex, yes, absolutely. So
I mean, really,
it would need
all-
to be thoroughly investigated.
Altogether, your view is at the moment that what you're proposing is proportionate. It's based on not necessarily surveyed evidence, but expectation, and that it is commensurate with something like the UK,
Yes.
even though they actually have a very different social composition that we do, and also their economy is based on a very different set of circumstances.
It's not identical to the UK's, it's not identical to Jersey's, and we pledged, I think I told Deputy Vermeulen in one of those drafting meetings at St James Chambers, that we would produce a booklet showing, or a leaflet showing exactly how it differs from the Jersey law and why. But it is actually far more similar to those pieces of legislation than the original draft that was put out and caused, I think, some consternation amongst the employer groups. And I think that's the explanation of why they've changed their stance, because the law that they're commenting on has changed significantly. And as far as the later stages, we're being charged to go and do that work. We have not come to any conclusions on what we will be bringing forward in that respect. I mean, I don't know what we'll do over sex discrimination updating, or what we'll do about age discrimination. Obviously, we have to bring back a report, but we're not... it shouldn't just be assumed that ESS will bring forward the purest and most socially avant-garde set of proposals, no matter what the cost, because we are absolutely acutely aware that cost is a big issue for the island at the moment.
I appreciate that. Just one final thing then. Obviously, the GFSC, who've given you a feedback, a critique, as it were, of the actual legislation, have said two things. One, obviously, that they are generally in agreement with the direction of the proposals, but they would like time for that to be introduced. But their critique, which I think many of us have seen, I'm sure you've seen it as well, was quite extensive. Mm-hmm. And it would seem to make sense that in order to address their concerns, that we actually are able to give some kind of delay in order that that be addressed and the legislation be amended accordingly.
Well, we are going to be doing our own review starting tomorrow of all of the representations that we've had to the technical consultation. I also do intend to meet with the employer groups to understand, although I'm very grateful that they're largely supportive of what their concerns are, and I'm not going to preempt what that conversation will have, but I can say that we are genuinely open-minded. If there's some wrinkle that we can change, that's fine. What I'm not going to do, I don't think, is go for what I think will be a several £100,000 survey to really try and drill down into the exact cost, which I think is probably quite untangible anyway and really difficult to achieve. As I say, even much larger communities have come back with a range of answers. So, but we will try to, as far as we can, address their fears. I mean, if it is going to change, if there are employers and service providers that are discriminating now, then obviously the legislation will have some impact on them. That is the intention of the legislation. So I can't say that it won't have any impact at all.
Okay, Deputy Ruffy, the group of four will look at calling for a delay on the discrimination legislation. What's the committee's response to that?
Our initial response is we don't really understand why that would be necessary, but I've said that we are going to be meeting with them. I think we got a date arranged in a week or two.
Early April, yes.
Early April, yeah. And we are genuinely open-minded over that. If there are cogent reasons why it has to go back a few months, we will not be. I'm not. Be careful. I'm speaking personally rather than on behalf of my committee here. Then, after the 17-year wait that we've been described, then so long as it's not a kicking down the road and down the road and down the road again, and we have a guaranteed date when it is going to come in, I will, if there are valid reasons, I'm open to considering them.
Thank you. And
I know that would very much frustrate anybody listening who's a part of any of the civil society groups who have been waiting and campaigning for this for 10, 12, 13 years in some cases. So, I've got to balance that. But it would be first to me and not to be open-minded.
the group GPEG commissioned a Jersey law firm to examine the proposals, and one point they made was that the change in legislation will significantly impact on small businesses, which comprise 64% of the Guernsey workforce. I think in some ways you've addressed that, but do you accept that analysis at all?
Not really. I mean, as I say, proportionality is absolutely the heart of this legislation, and therefore I can understand why that would be seen in theory, but I think the practical implementation will mean that is not going to be the case. And as I say, Jersey, perhaps not quite so much as Guernsey, but also has a plethora of smaller employers as well, who are living with very similar legislation. So I don't really see, I don't agree with that, no.
And the key point being that small businesses will be expected to do less than big businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly so.
Thank you.
Sorry, Ellen,
I was going to say training obviously will be very important. That will be offered free of charge in the lead up to legislation coming into force, and also guidance notes, guidance documents will be prepared. So often, you know, as long as people understand what it is that their duties will be, that's kind of the main barrier, I think, for small businesses who perhaps don't have, you know, a HR department to rely on. So yeah, producing kind of easy to understand guidance notes is what we're going to do.
If small businesses do make a mistake because they don't have the HR departments, the whole law is predicated on the idea that the conciliation will be the first tranche, that we avoid tribunals as far as possible, because really, why would you want to hold tribunals for the sake of it? So, A, the obligations on small employers will be less, and B, if they slip up, there will be, you know, informal remedies that will be able to be addressed. So, no, I don't, to be honest, I don't really accept much of what GPEG has said on this. They describe themselves as a think tank, but they do really seem to be a pressure group in this particular respect, and a pressure group that doesn't reflect certainly what employers are thinking. So I'm not sure who they're a pressure group on behalf of, but such is life.
Last October, the States narrowly rejected your committee's proposal to extend the ground of religious belief to religion and belief, which would have incorporated beliefs which aren't religious. You were in the committee last term, weren't you, Deputy Roffey? Were you part of the Social Security Committee last term?
At the end of the term I was.
Yes.
When Deputy Follows left, I joined.
Right, and why do you recall in that case why your committee didn't propose religion and belief in the first place, and rather sought to amend it by a proposition in the most recent policy letter?
I can't. But Ellen was working day in, day out with that. I came in very much part way through all of the discussions over the proposals that came forward, so it may have been before my time. But
So the committee was developing proposals for a more wide multi-ground piece of legislation with 9 or 10 grounds, and at that point in time, so we went out to consultation in the summer of 2019 regarding proposals for this wide piece of legislation, and religious belief was one of the proposed grounds in that consultation document, and that primarily was based on the fact that our model was based largely around the Irish discrimination legislation, and in Ireland religious belief is the ground that they cover rather than religion and belief. And then we got the consultation feedback. There was very significant changes to the proposals before they then went to the States, and actually what we took to the States didn't include religion and belief, because we were taking proposals for phase 1, which the committee was proposing would just cover disability, carer status and race. And religion was actually brought into phase 1 as a result of an amendment laid by Deputy Parkinson, which was approved. And that included religion because it was based on the proposals that were in the original consultation document from the summer of 2019, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So in a sense, it wasn't proposed by the committee.
There is something slightly perverse that there were a lot of people complaining that the original proposal was far too close to the Irish, and why aren't you going with the UK? When we actually took that on board and have moved far closer to the UK and far a long way away from the Irish legislation. And yet, I think some of the same group of people were responsible for lobbying for us to go from religion and belief, which is the UK definition, to back to the Irish one. So there's a certain irony in all of that. I regret it. I think it is it's bigoted, really, actually, to say that only religious belief is worthy of protection and other belief systems aren't. But, you know, that's democratic decision of the states.
It does seem to be discriminatory in a discrimination legislation in an ironic sort of way. Do you regret, really, given how far you've had to sort of paddle away from it, do you regret basing your initial proposals on the Irish legislation in the first place?
I wasn't a part of that decision. I think the way things have panned out is very easy in hindsight. I think, yes, probably, because we've probably had to. It's probably been a painful process to compromise to where we are now. And having said that, I think the original proposals were put forward with absolutely laudable intentions. Guernsey may not have been ready for them, and maybe never will be, but I think that they had features in them which in themselves were actually very socially desirable. So I don't criticise my predecessors for doing that, but the way things have spun out, probably it would have been a less painful road if we'd gone closer to the UK and Jersey legislation at the beginning.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have any more questions on discrimination?
I do, can I?
Yes, John.
You've dismissed the comments of GPEG, but others from the finance sector have made the point that Guernsey must remain competitive, and not for the small businesses, but for the large finance businesses. They're in Jersey, they're in Guernsey, they may be in the Cayman Islands, or even in Connecticut, all over the place. So they can move at the drop of a hat, and the point has been made by one of the financial institutions here to you that there is a question mark over proportionality vis-à-vis the Jersey model, for example, and I raised earlier the question of the maximum claims, which are much, much higher and could be very significant even for the large firms in terms of what they're proposing to do, and also the definition of disability is so broad here. Could you please undertake to look at those points before bringing the legislation forward, because they are serious points in terms of competitiveness. We have to remain competitive in the finance sector, or we have nothing.
Okay. What we can't do, I think, is we need to look at what has already been decided as policy matters by the states. It is simply unconstitutional for us to bring back a legislation that people are free to amend it from the floor of the House, but does not reflect what the states have decided on policy, because that's not what the policy discussion is. To have legislative drafting instructions, and we have to follow those. So I have to say, looking at the maximum awards here, I'm not sure. I mean, six months' pay is the maximum award under this, which is very much in line with unfair dismissal and other bits of legislation. So I don't think that they're quite as vicious as you purport.
the Jersey caps for damages and pain and suffering and upset and that sort of thing?
Yeah, you're right in the sense that Jersey's maximum is 5,000, I think, for whereas Guernsey says up to 10,000. But I think there's almost a presumption in Jersey that 5,000 is a benchmark, whereas from here we're from 0 to 10,000.
What you're referring to, the injury to feelings compensation, would be based on a sort of scale. So whilst the maximum that the States has approved is £10,000, it would really have to be a very egregious, probably very long-standing sort of multiple cases of sort of poor behaviour to actually warrant that sort of level. It would be sort of, so it would be on a scale of sort of, a sliding scale.
But you need to look at the rest of it with the, our 6 months salary is a very high figure and very much higher than the Jersey caps. But
Okay, well,
if you would look at that.
Yeah, we're happy to look at that, certainly. But what I was saying is that we are not free to amend the legislation in a way that is at odds with the drafting instructions. So even if we look at it, if that was a clear element of the drafting instructions, we wouldn't be able to move away from it. I can't know off the top of my head whether that's the case or not, but I will undertake that we will look at it as part of the review of feedback that we're about to undertake. But what I would say about competitiveness generally, I mean, I know you've drawn that particular point about Jersey's penalties regime, is that there are very few of our direct competitors that don't have some sort of legislation along these lines already. We are certainly not in the vanguard of bringing them in, so we are very much a late adopter in that respect.
Thank you. Deputy Fairclough, would you like to move on to the next section?
Yes, if we could move on to a couple of other areas that are covered by your committee's mandate, specifically in relation to things that are quite topical: minimum wage, inflation, social insurance. Given the ongoing increases in inflation and the impact of world events on prices locally and the impact on the cost of living, do the Guernsey public have to accept that in the short term, at least, the costs of supporting islanders in need of assistance will continue to rise?
Yes. At the moment, we have a presumed operating policy for non-contributory benefits, which is simply mirroring RPIX, and I expect RPIX this year, and as I said, saying before we started, we tend to take the quarter, the second end of the second quarter. I expect it to be much higher than it's been in recent years, and therefore, when we come forward in October, I think it is, that's November for the non-contributory ones, because it's go alongside the budget. If inflation is 6.5%, we will, I imagine. We haven't yet discussed it. That's a discussion we have to have. But I think we're talking about people below which we think there'll be intolerable poverty. To actually reduce, in real terms, their income would be, I think, unconscionable. So I think we probably will be proposing RPIX. Likewise with the old age pension, where we have a RPIX moderated for 1/3 of the difference between that and the change in average earnings. That will obviously be driven as well, and same with a lot of the other benefits. So I'm afraid inflation will have quite a significant impact on the amount of money we're asking the states to provide.
But some of those changes won't come in time for people who need help more urgently.
Yeah, it's difficult because inflation goes up and inflation goes down. And if there was some kind of, a bit like we did with the gas thing, if there was some kind of absolutely historical spike that we weren't expecting, then I think we might have to look at some kind of supplementary measure. But certainly when we're in single figures inflation, it does balance out, because there'll be other years when at the end of June it's sort of 6%, but inflation's going down. So when it actually implemented the next year, inflation is only 4%. So I think the administration involved in anything other than an annual review of benefits is so significant that it would have to be fairly extraordinary circumstances for us to actually do that.
And the data and analysis team recently sent out an invitation to the public for information on rent prices to help them accurately cost the basket of goods. Are you content that it remains the best option in this time of rising inflation, particularly where things like foodstuffs are concerned and fuel prices?
Yeah, I mean, the minimum income standard review is the first time that we've done that since the work that led up to income support being introduced. And it's definitely time, it was time. In fact, it was slipped a year or two because of the pandemic. That will also be used to inform the operating policy letter on income support this year. It is imperfect. I mean, we can say what we expect a typical family with pensioner couple on income support or a family with young children spend their money on. It may not actually be what they spend their money on, though no two families are the same. I probably spend more on red wine than the typical single man. Sorry, that's flippant, and I shouldn't be flippant on such a serious subject. But, you know, we think that the exercise is as good as we can get to inform what people's basic needs are. But, you know, it won't always be perfect.
Deputy Roth, you mentioned, and I actually remember because I was there at the time, about the inflation that we actually encountered back in the 80s when things were exacerbated, I suppose, by the fuel crisis of the 70s and so forth. And I can remember as an apprentice, we were actually talking about 6 monthly reviews of salary because inflation had gone crazy. I have the suspicion that the Ukraine crisis has initiated a similar period of inflation. So would this be something that you would be reviewing? Because I think, as Deputy Fairclough has said, we'll be in catch-up, or those people in the most difficulties will be in catch-up mode a lot of the time.
Yeah. Obviously, as I said, if there's an absolute spike and it becomes clearly that it's an historical oddity, then I think we would have to look at that. It's not something that we've considered, but we probably would have to, because we don't want everybody sort of spending 6 months not being able to afford to put food on their table. But there would be quite an administrative challenge in doing that, and we would have to take it back to the States for permission to do it. And I think my guideline is sort of, you know, in single figure inflation, I don't think the cost in administration would be worthwhile doing that. But who knows where we're heading? The world's a bit crazy at the moment, and we're certainly open to doing that. Our whole remit, our whole ethos is to try and help people who are struggling in Guernsey. So it would be perverse if we weren't open to that sort of idea.
Move on to the tax review. The tax review proposes to reorganise social security contributions. However, it is becoming increasingly obvious that the GST part of the package will either not be brought to the Assembly as planned this summer or will not gain majority support. Can you therefore outline any alternative plans your committee has to continue with overhauling the contribution system to make it fairer?
Well, what we can't do is afford anything like the sort of package that would be a part of the overall tax package without putting. In fact, I asked for some work to be done on the other day, and I'll ask it to be explained. But we can always do it. If we put up social security contributions, the headline figure to an enormous amount, then of course you can afford to bring in the features we're talking about below. And the main feature is that I'll bring in an income tax style personal allowance for social security, so below which you will pay nothing, and above which you will only pay on what you earn above that threshold. At the moment, we have, as you are well aware, but others may not be, a very low threshold below which you don't pay social security. But the real bugbear is that the minute you go above that, you don't just pay on what's above that, you pay on every single pound that you earn. And that is really, really harsh on low earners. So whether GST is going to be acceptable or not, I don't think it's my job to speculate on here today. Whether alternative ways of raising money, the same amount of money, whether it be on taxes on income or other ways, you know, the social security element doesn't rely on how that money is raised, just on that money being raised. But if nothing was raised that way, and we were just trying to do internally, I'm going to ask Ellen to run through the figures I asked her to produce.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll just read it out so I express it correctly. So if the committee wanted to restructure the contribution system as proposed in the tax strategy without raising any more income and without any alternative revenue, it would be necessary to increase the combined employee contribution rate from 13.5%, which is its current level, to about 15.5%. And if the committee then also wanted to use it to raise the revenues needed to fund the pension and long-term care schemes over the next 50 years, so to make our current schemes sustainable in the long term, it would be necessary to increase the combined employee contribution rate to more like 18%. So it's a 2% increase to sort of fund the restructure to leave us in our current position, which is where we're in a deficit financial position, and another 2.5% on top of that to remove the deficit.
And while that would achieve I think we would then come back to Deputy Dyke's point about competitiveness with other jurisdictions, and I think we would find that very difficult to persuade the states to do. What have to be remembered, though, if all of this gets thrown out, the extra 2.5%, not the restructuring, the bit to make us sustainable, the states have already agreed a path for that, which is actually increases in contribution rates under the current system every year for the next 10 years. And that is far from being the optimal solution. It's necessary because we don't want to run out of money in our funds, but it means that if the system's unfair now, the burden on the lower earners will just go up each of the next 10 years as those incremental increases come in.
Is it possible to turn percentages mentioned by Ellen into costs, either to the states or to the individual in proportionate terms?
It depends what they earn, obviously. But it doesn't take... Let's take somebody on £100,000, because that's probably the easiest figure to do. If you're talking about a 2% increase, which would be split between employer and employee, or unless you're self-employed, of course, then 2% of 100,000 is going to be 2,000. If you have the extra 2.5% to make us sustainable, which we do need, then you're talking 4.5%. So you're talking 4,500 being extracted from somebody on 100,000. Now, somebody who is on 20,000 may find themselves better off, because even though their contribution rate will also go up to 18.5% or whatever it was, they won't start paying until they get past the threshold, which may be sort of 12, 13, 14,000. We haven't actually, I don't think the work's been done to have an exact amount yet. So theirs may go down. But for the well-paid person, relatively well-paid person, or middle Guernsey, if you like, there would be a heck of a hit. And I think I'd find that really difficult to get through the states. But
Given that we're told there's no money in the pot, how much would these Plan B cost the states? If you had to change your proposals, what would the cost of the states?
The states are an employer, and they play the employer section of the contributions. So I don't know exact payroll of the states, and as I say, the lower paid people may not be paying much more. We may not be paying much more, but certainly I think it would be fairly significant, yeah.
Okay.
To be honest, I don't think we can afford to do the sort of restructure in the package without the tax element being there. I think it's unrealistic to expect Social Security to just do that. Now, it doesn't have to be GST, it can be another form of taxation, but unless taxation is raised, I don't think we can afford the Social Security restructure. We might be able to do something smaller to make it a bit fairer, because there's some historical things that have crept in that seem unfair. I mean, it's a bit perverse that, you know, the examples I've given on the sort of roadshow is that if you earn 50,000, it's all earned income from a job, you pay a certain amount. If it's all unearned income, say from rents or whatever, if you're a landlord, it's actually slightly more. But if you earn 10,000 and the other 40,000 comes from unearned income, it's way less, because you just do it on the earned part of the income. So there are things like that that we could address, but it's not the underlying unfairness. I don't think we'd be able to afford to.
I must say, I was very keen on the original proposals, having worked them out myself. I would have ended up better off. I'm not saying I'm poor, but I was... It
wasn't done with you in mind, I'm afraid.
No.
Yeah.
Yes, I didn't think it was. I just move on to the question of the ageing demographic. And the older I get, and I'm now in the ageing demographic, I think I've always have been, but I'm very much there now. What will the impact be on future Social Security policy over the coming decades, especially in the context of the likely need to increase spending on pensions and health and social care? We hear about that all the time, that there's not enough homes for the aged, etc., etc. So what would the impact be on social security policy?
Well, the health and social care bit is less to do with us now, although obviously we're still responsible for the long-term care insurance, and therefore the growth in the need for residential and nursing care will be with us. The actual main health fund has sort of been transferred across now to HSC, although it's still collected at the moment through social security contributions. But the pension, yeah, is absolutely graphic. I mean, even with putting up and pension age at the moment is 65 6 months, and it goes up 2 months every year, and it will reach 70 in whatever year it is, 2048, is it, something like that?
Yep.
Even with that change, which many people deprecate, the spending on pensions is going to be going up really, really steeply, and that is one of the reasons drawing the tax review. It's not all about what we spend in taxes; it's what we take from people's pockets holistically, and that is exactly why we put forward and got approved this proposal for a 0.1% increase on both employers and employees for the next 10 years, because that is the only way we'll be able to carry on paying pensions in 30 or 40 years' time. So really large, I think, is the answer.
Just one supplementary. Do you believe that the voice of pensioners is heard by states members in particular?
Coming up to election time, I think they take an awful lot of notice because they know that pensioners tend to vote in very large numbers. But it is really difficult I try to be a voice of pensioners where I can, because I think they've lost out in some ways, but generational equity is difficult. We're going to have, for instance, if you take the long-term care insurance, we'll have people getting quite a big benefit. They're really, because it was only brought in about 15 years ago, and if they're 85 going into a home, they may have paid almost nothing into it. Supporting them will be people who are going to spend a lifetime, up to 70 now, from 20, 50 years, paying really quite high contributions. So we do have to think about the working age population as well. We do have to think about what burden we put on Guernsey's youth who are having to the expensive housing costs. Otherwise, we will drive them away from the island. So there does need to be a balance. Pensions are coddly, but you do need a workforce as well. So trying to get that balance is really quite difficult.
Thank you.
Right, just to wrap up, because we've come up to our time now, just one final question to end up on. The minimum wage, do you consider that the minimum wage of £9.05, I think it is, which is equivalent to about £1,600 a month for a 40-hour week, and that's before deductions, do you think that's sufficient in today's financial climate?
Do I think it's what, sorry?
Sufficient.
No, and the states don't. The states have told us over a 5-year period to move the minimum wage to 60% of average earnings, and I'm almost apologetic there was a hiatus in that process, but it was done for the right reasons, I think. We were not sure what the economic impact of the lockdowns was going to be on the local economy, and to try and put that burden on the employer at that time seemed wrong. We really wanted to protect jobs, so in retrospect, I think we probably could have pushed it a little bit more than we did last year, and one of the problems is there's several months' process of consultation, and therefore we weren't sure what the bounce back was like when we put out the first proposals, but we will. I've told the states we will be now looking to move back. So over the next 3 years, I think it is, we're moving to 60% of average earnings. It's never meant to be enough to mean that everybody, in all circumstances, if they're working, will not need benefits, because that's just not realistic. But we will be moving to a far more realistic minimum wage, I think.
But on that point of having to top up with benefits, to what extent do you have any figures to show the extent to which the taxpayer essentially is subsidising employers who pay the minimum wage?
I think that's a bit unfair, because, the employer could be paying the same wage to 2 different people. One, a single person with no dependents, and they don't need any kind of top-up whatsoever. The other one could be to a woman with a disabled husband and 3 children and heavy rent, and then suddenly you'll say, oh, the taxpayers topping them up, but it's actually their social circumstances that are the demand. So obviously a higher minimum wage will tend to reduce the demands on income support, because more of the money each family needs will come from employment, and therefore somewhat less will need to come from the taxpayer. But I think it's a bit pejorative to accuse employers of sort of being subsidised. I think there are certain industries where I think if we expected them to pay enough to mean that there was never any question of any benefit being required, then, to be honest, they would be so uncompetitive they just wouldn't be able to exist.
Okay.
And income support's there for a reason. I mean, it's there, it's an in-work benefit, and it is, communities say, it's almost a redistributive benefit. And I think the idea that we want nobody to ever depend upon it is probably wrong. It's there to be used.
Thank you. And so that brings us to the end, a little bit over time, but thank you to all the witnesses for attending and for increasing the public awareness of the work that you do in your committee. And thank you to the members of the media and the public for attending, and for those watching the live stream. Scrutiny undertakes regular public hearings with all the principal committees to increase public understanding of key areas of government, and the next hearing will be on the 8th of April, and Deputy de Somre will be making a return appearance. That's for the Committee for Environment and Infrastructure. So thank you everybody, and the meeting is now closed. Thank you.